once again, everybody, and welcome to the second set of lectures covering Chapter 2 in your fine textbook, Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner. And we will be covering today the beginnings of English America from roughly 1607 to 1660. Start off with the focus question for this section. What were the main contours of English colonization in the 17th century? Well, England in the 17th century was really still a tiny backwater country, or kingdom as it were, in Europe at the time. It was really not strong or stable enough to embark on significant colonization ventures in the Americas. Unlike the Spanish, who by the end of the 15th century had really consolidated some centralized authority in the region and were able to project that power out, England was still riven with internal strife and really did not have the capability to really embark on any significant missions or ventures. There were still significant religious tensions as England transitioned from Catholic to Anglican. Henry VIII's a mandate to separate from the Catholic Church and create the Anglican Church caused lots of internal religious strife as many Catholics pushed back against such a transition. And Henry VIII's successors really vacillated between support for Catholicism and Anglicanism. This woman you see right here is Mary I. She took over after Henry VIII, or after Henry VIII's son, actually. And she was a staunch Catholic and really persecuted a lot of Protestants in the area. Now, Elizabeth I, the fine woman you see here, she began a period of relative religious tolerance, although Anglicanism remained the official state religion, and she really pushed the Protestant faith. Also going on in the 16th century was the English conquest of Ireland. Although the conquest had really kind of started in the 13th century, in the 16th century it really began to build up steam, and it continued this long and violent attempt to conquer the entire Irish island. They justified this conquest by claiming they were bringing civilization to wild Ireland. Now, Ireland at the time was still very much dominated by various tribes and clans, and really had that sort of social structure going on. And they were predominantly Catholic, which of course to the emerging Protestant England was a problem. And this conquest of Ireland really helped to establish similar patterns of conquest and colonization that were repeated in the Americas, particularly related to this tribal, clannish nature of Irish society. Once the English met Native Americans in the Americas, they had an analog there. They really compared them to their experience with the Irish tribes and clans. Also going on in England at this time was what was known as the Enclosure Movement. Now, in medieval England, pasture lands were held as commons and available to unlanded peasants to use for their mainly flocks of sheep, because in medieval England particularly, wool was one of the primary economic goods and really drove the economy of England at the time. While the Enclosure Movement began in the 12th century, it gained significant steam in the 16th and the early 17th century. The nobility and the landed gentry fenced off the commons, which forced many of the peasants off the land as they attempted to consolidate their own economic power and influence. Now, this forced many peasants to migrate into cities seeking new economic opportunities, which created a fierce competition for scarce jobs and created a whole new class of urban poor in England. So, in response to this rising class of urban poor, the Americas came to be seen as a refuge for England's surplus population of poor and what were called masterless men. And they were viewed very much as a danger to English society. So, to these men, who were deemed masterless and really had very low economic opportunities in England at the time, immigration to America really seemed like an escape from this economic inequality. There were tremendous opportunities in their eyes for land ownership in Americas, which was a great incentive for immigration. Because remember, land was very tightly aligned with not only wealth, but status in English society. Previous lecture series that covered chapter 1 in your textbooks, we discussed the writings of Ptolemy de las Casas, which, thanks to the invention of the printing press in Europe about a little over a century before, were able to spread very quickly and widely across the European continent. The atrocities described by Las Casas of the Spanish conquest gave rise to what was known as the Black Legend, which painted Spain as particularly violent and egregiously even evil in their dealings with the Native Americans. Now, Protestant regions, particularly England, use it as proof of Catholic barbarism. Now, they used this Black Legend as justification for their own colonization and conquest. There began a drive to push the Spanish out of the New World, free the mistreated natives, and bring them into the Protestant fold. But a lot of historians argue that really this was just a smokescreen to conceal their true motives, which was to gain access to that tremendous amount of wealth that began to flow out of Spanish America, particularly after large quantities of gold and silver in particularly were found in Mexico and the Andean region of South America. The first attempt by the English to establish a presence in the Americas occurred between 1584 and 1590 on the island of Roanoke, right here in North Carolina. These missions were financed by Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a favorite of Elizabeth I, and of course the gentleman that our own capital of Raleigh is named after. Now, the original intent was to establish a privateering base in the Americas to attack the Spanish ships who were returning from the New World laden with gold and silver from Mexico and the Andean region of South America. Now, the difference between privateering and piracy is really one of degree, not kind. Privateers essentially had a license from their home governments to attack enemy shipping, whereas pirates really had a carte blanche to attack anyone they so desired, including, of course, ships from their own home country of origin. Now, contrary to popular belief, Raleigh himself never actually came to the Americas. As I mentioned, he was a favorite of Elizabeth I, some say even romantically involved with her, so she was really reticent to allow him to venture out into such dangerous areas. She'd rather keep him very much close to home. Now, the first expedition was really a fact-finding mission. It was led by John White and Thomas Harriot, who conducted scientific and anthropological research. They really wanted to learn about the peoples of the area, the geography of the area, the plant and animal life found in the area, if there was any gold or silver or anything like that to be found. And really, you see here an example of one of John White's watercolors that he made. He made hundreds of these, documenting the Native Americans in the region. And really, White and Harriot's research and the information that they brought back with them still stands to this day as some of the most important documentation of American Indian life and culture in the region prior to European contact. Now, the second expedition was a military expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane. They really had tried to establish a permanent fort on Roanoke from which they could launch these privateering expeditions that I previously mentioned. Now, this second expedition ended in disastrous conflict with the natives. The English accused one of the native villages of stealing one of their silver cups, which resulted in the English attacking the native village, and of course that resulted in retaliation and some back and forth violence, and really the conflict almost wiped out Lane's group completely, and they were only really saved at the last minute when Sir Francis Drake, probably the most famous English privateer of all time, just happened to stop by Roanoke on his way back from one of his own privateering missions to the Spanish Caribbean to check on Lane's and Grenville's fort and see what was going on. Of course, he saw what had happened and offered to bring them back to England with him, and of course Lane and Grenville jumped at the chance. Now, the third expedition was once again led by John White, and this was really a full attempt at establishing a permanent colony in the Americas. The colonists that came over were not military men. They were primarily family units, women and children included, and their initial plan was to travel and establish some sort of colony up in the Chesapeake region in what is now Virginia, as of course, due to the conflicts with the previous expedition and Native Americans in the area, tensions were rather high in the region, and White and his group hoped that they could avoid that by bypassing Roanoke and attempting to establish something new up in the Chesapeake region. However, due to various circumstances, including weather issues, hurricanes, and stuff like that in the Caribbean that blew them off course and delayed their arrival, as well as the desire of some of the men who manned the ships that brought them over, particularly their Portuguese navigator, who really desired to dump them off as quick as possible so they could get back to the Caribbean to conduct some privateering expeditions of their own, decided to dump them off on Roanoke Island instead of taking them all the way up to the Chesapeake region. Now, they arrived after the planting season, so they weren't really able to sow any crops of their own, and of course, due to the conflict between the Native Americans and the previous expedition, Native Americans of the region were not quite very welcoming to the colonists and really didn't want to give them any sort of assistance in helping their colony survive. So, less than a month after White and his people arrived in Roanoke, some of his folks convinced White to return to England and try to secure a few ships laden with supplies that they could bring over to help them get through until the following season when they could plant their own crops. But White had a hard time returning to Roanoke. In the interim, in 1588, the Spanish had launched a huge armada of well over 100 ships to sail north and attack and attempt to conquer the English Isles. So Elizabeth I halted any sort of transatlantic voyages at the time, as she wanted to keep all of the available ships around England to help defend against the Spanish Armada. Now, by the time all of that was over, White was not able to return to Roanoke until about 1590, several years after he had left. When he arrived in Roanoke, he discovered that the colonists were nowhere to be found. And I'm sure many of you have heard the legend of the lost colony. The only thing that John White found on Roanoke Island was the word Croatoan carved into a nearby tree, which was an agreed-upon signal that White and his people had decided prior to White's leaving for England. They had said that, if anything were to happen, they would leave some sort of sign indicating where they had gone to. And the Croatoans were a friendlier tribe of Native Americans who lived around Hatteras Island at the time. So White assumed that something had happened, some sort of conflict perhaps with the natives on Roanoke had occurred, and the colonists had escaped and attempted to reach the friendly Croatoan Indians on Hatteras. White attempted to reach Hatteras and find the colonists. However, a hurricane blew up at around this time, which prevented White from reaching Hatteras Island, and eventually White gave up and went back to England. Now, there are many different theories and speculations as to what happened to the Roanoke colonists, the lost colony. Some say that they did reach the Croatoans and perhaps integrated into their tribe. Others say that they were, of course, attacked and killed off by the Native Americans in and around Roanoke. Some say they were captured and sold off into slavery and to other tribes in the interior of North Carolina, possibly even Virginia. Lots of different theories, lots of different speculations, but of course, no one really knows for sure, and the legend and the speculation continues to this day. That concludes the first part of the lecture for Chapter 2, The Beginnings of English America. Stay tuned for the second part. In the meantime, study hard. We'll see you soon.